So everyone now should be able to connect to the audio. If you have any issues, just let me type it in the chat. Cool. So let's start. How many people have arrived? 11, 12. Oh, people are still arriving, so I guess we will wait 1 or 2 minutes. So let me introduce myself. My name is Harshal, and I am a first year student at ISI Bangalore. The main topic of this talk will be surfaces, a glimpse of topology. So we will be first introducing topology as a subject, how it developed, uh, its connections to other subjects, and then we will move on to the main topic, which is surfaces. Let me now share my screen. Is the voice laggy for everyone? Cool. Now I'm sharing my screen. So you should now be able to see the slides. If not, just ping in the chat. Is everyone able to see the? Yeah, cool. So yeah, I introduce myself. My name is Harshul, and I'm a first year student at ISI Bangalore. So let's start with the talk. So the main content of this talk will be, first we will be discussing the background and history of the subject topology, how it developed, its connection to other subjects, its roots. Then we will start with a very famous example, a very classical theorem called Jordan curve theorem, which is deceptively simple, but it's hard to prove once you set out to do it. Next, we will move on to surfaces, and we will characterize different types of surfaces, and then we will move on to classifying orientable surfaces with boundary. And if time permits, we will talk about non-orientable surfaces. And at last, and the most important part, I guarantee that this will be done. We will show some fancy pictures for sure. So next, so what really is topology? Uh, as opposed to its counterpart, its crude country cousin, geometry. Geometry is a study of properties which are very fine. So, like for example, the lengths, the angles, the geodesics, which depends on the shape itself, right? So now we are actually in mathematics. We what we try to do is we take a concept and we try to make it abstract. So, for example, in geometry, now the modern geometry includes generalization of notion of shape. So what we do is we take a metric and introduce it. So we you have studied metric in the first talk, right? So I can talk about open sets. Yes. Can I talk about open sets? You must have covered in the first talk that happened today. Yeah, cool. So what we do is we take a metric space and introduce it to a space. Now what does that do is we get a notion of geodesic, the shortest path between 2 points, and etc. So that's geometry. But now, what is topology? Now, topology is the study of coarse property of this space. For example, uh, let's say what you do is you take a coffee mug, and a donut. You can continuously deform them into each other. So they are essentially the same in a topological sense. So topology is basically the study of properties that are invariant under continuous deformations. So these continuous deformations that are continuously invertible are called homeomorphisms. So a coffee mug is homeomorphic to uh, a donut. And by the way, if it lags anywhere in between, just let me know in the chat. I will repeat. Someone just told me that Jordan curve theorem part lagged, but that is no problem because we will cover it in the assignment. Actually, we will talk about it as it comes later. Cool. So let's move on. So we now know what is topology. So first we talk about history of topology. So the first mention of topology as a subject was in 1736 by Euler. Somehow every subject traces its roots back to Euler. Euler was a genius. So it started with, let me show, the famous seven bridge problem. You know what is a seven bridge problem? Does anyone not know it? Basically, you take a graph. Let's say you take this graph, uh, or any other, let's say, and you talk about, can we traverse it without lifting our pen or repeating any path? So note that this problem, yeah, wait 1 second. No, you have not missed anything important. This lecture is of 1.5 hours. We just discussed the content of the subject and what is topology. So topology is basically the study of properties that are invariant under continuous deformations. So let's say you take a, so you talk about connectedness, because connectedness is not a fine property of the surface of a space. Like for example, angle is a fine property of the space, but if you continuously deform that space, you will get a different angle. So we don't want to study that. We want to study properties which are invariant under these transformations. That's all I mentioned. That's it. Yeah. So note, in this problem, we don't care what is the length of the bridges. We don't care how what is the angle of the bridges. We just care what is how the edges are connected. That's all that matters. So this was a Euler observed that this was a problem that does not come under any type of mathematics done before him. So he called it geometry situs. And then in next 1752, Euler was studying the polyhedrons, and he observed a very interesting. Let me erase this first. Yeah. So yeah. So he was studying polyhedrons, and he observed a very surprising formula, which is V minus E plus F is equal to 2 for all convex polyhedrons. So what you do is basically, in a convex polyhedron, you count the number of vertices, the edges, and the number of faces, and this quantity is an invariant. Note again, this formula does not depend on the lengths of the edges. Like you see how it does not matter how big the polyhedron is or how small, right? So in 1830, next, Lulier noticed that this formula did not hold for surfaces which had holes in them. Like for example, you can see here, this is a triple torus and this is a normal torus. What you do is basically you introduce triangulation on them, because so there is something called compactness. So these surfaces are compact. That's why you can triangulate it with finite number of triangles. You need not care about it, but just as a fact that you should know it. So he noticed that this V minus E plus F is still an invariant, but the constant, that is 2, is changed for the number of holes. So the number of holes we called it as genus of the surface. For example, in a torus the genus is 1, and in a double torus the genus is 2, and so on. Genus of a sphere is 0, right? So he noticed that V minus E plus F is equal to 2 minus 2G, where G is the genus of the surface. It is a topological invariant because again it does not depend on the geometry, but just the topology, which in this case is the number of holes. Cool. So next we'll talk about Poincaré's contributions. Now Poincare was a very important figure in mathematics, especially related to topology, algebraic geometry, algebraic topology. He basically single-handedly progressed the. So notice that in 1813, after 1813, for a long time there was no mention of topology in the field of mathematics. Poincare basically reintroduced topology and gave it a very rigorous foundation. So earlier Riemann was discussing the connectedness of surface. Let me show. So basically, what you do is, suppose you have a double torus. So you have this double torus. What you do is basically remove curves from it until it becomes disconnected. So for example, if you remove, let's say, this curve, then the surface becomes disconnected. So don't do that. But if you disconnect this curve, you remove the surface along this curve, which goes through the hole, you end with a connected surface. You can see, right? So you end with a surface that is homeomorphic to a cylinder, let's say. Because now imagine if you cut along these two circles, arcs, you get a straight. You get basically this becomes a separate region. Yeah. So basically, what we do is the last part means the one I'm doing, or the genus part. Can you specify which part to repeat? Uh, I am assuming it is this part only, that the torus part. So what you do is basically we take a double torus and we want to disconnect curves from it until it becomes disconnected. So for example, let's say yeah, yeah, it stopped for a second. Yeah. So suppose we disconnect these two curves, the surface is still connected, right? So what they proved was the number of curves that you can remove, the maximum number of curves that you can remove before disconnecting a surface is same as the genus of the surface. So for example, two in this double torus, uh, in a torus, let's say for example, in this example of a torus, you remove this curve, right? So that any more curve you can, if you will remove, you will disconnect the surface. So the number is 1, which is again the number of holes in the surface, right? So let me remove it. Annotations. Cool. Yeah. So Betty basically generalized this idea. What Betty said was, we will talk about the number of k-dimensional holes in the surface. For example, in a torus, there are two types of 2D holes, the ones indicated in the surface. Uh, these both cannot be transformed into each other. For example, you take this loop, you can in no way transform into the other loop, right? So this is the one. Note that a circle is a one dimensional. You see this, why circle is a one dimensional surface, not a one dimensional curve, not a two dimensional. You need only one dimension to actually represent every point on the surface, which is the angle, right? Using an angle, you can represent every point on the surface. So this is a one-dimensional surface. Though you need two dimensions to represent it, but it is a one-dimensional curve. You understand it, right? If not, someone can ping in the chat, and I will repeat. Yeah. So no, we don't care about distance. Dis- we only need we only need one dimension to represent the points. Like suppose you have, this is theta. So now every point can be represented using theta. R is the distance from the center is same for every point on the circle. You need not represent. You do not need it to exclusively represent some point. You only need the angle. Clear? Yeah. So in a torus, we see that these are the two one-dimensional holes, and in no way we can transform it into the another one, right? So B1 is equal to 2 for a torus. Now, what B1 is normally for torus, for double torus, is equal to 2 times the genus, right? So this is all informally. Formally, the nth Betti number is the rank of nth homology group of a topological space, but you need not worry about it. What we mainly care about is what it represents right now. Now, beta 2 is a number of two-dimensional holes. So let's talk about it. So what we mean about what we mean by saying two-dimensional hole. So instead of removing curves now, you will remove a two-dimensional. Let's say you remove a square or a disk, a filled disk. That is. Note, in my talk, I will always refer the filled circle by disk. Okay. So you will now for beta two, for B2, you essentially remove these squares, disks. So you can see beta 2 is equal to 1 for torus. For example, if you remove any disk from the surface of a torus, it will disconnect it. It will become a different, like not essentially disconnected, it will become a different surface, right? I just wanted to talk about this two-dimensional surfaces right now. Yeah. So let me clear the screen. So now a very natural question arises. If given a surface, so what it is basically, let me define a manifold for you first. So manifold informally, a nth manifold, n-dimensional manifold, is a space which locally looks like a n dimensional space, but overall it can be curved, it can be, it can be different. For example, given a surface, let's say given a torus, it's a two-dimensional manifold. Locally, every point looks like a plane. Basic example, look on the look basically uh, look at the earth, right? You're standing on it. Locally, every point is looking like a plane, but overall sphere is curved, right? So it's a two-dimensional manifold. Local, so we mathematicians say that the local topology is of a plane, is of a n-dimensional surface. Cool. So what we say is a very natural question arises: if given a manifold, all the Betti numbers are the same, is this manifold essentially uniquely determined? Well, answer is no. We need more than Betti numbers to actually uniquely determine the surface. Yeah, so Poincare first asked this question: if all the Betti numbers are the same for a manifold, does it uniquely determine it? So instead of looking at the way of disconnecting arcs, he looked at it at a different perspective. So what he did was, given a topological space, so given a two manifold, let me draw it. So suppose you are given a manifold. Let's start with a basic sphere. Suppose this was a sphere. You take any loop on it, right? I take suppose this loop on it and I contract it. So I can always reach a point on like if I suppose I take a point, let's say this one, and I start contracting the loop towards that point. I will always reach the point no matter whatever the loop, no matter whatever the point, right? Just say yes or no on the chat. Yeah. So, but if I instead take a torus, for example, so for example, you can see this curve. Let me draw it again. Suppose I take this curve and start contracting it. I can never reach a single point, right? Similarly, for this curve, I can never reach a single point on it. So essentially, this surface is different from this surface. Now, continuous deformation of loops is called homotopy. So this curve is never homotopic to this curve. Let's say this on a sphere instead, this curve which I drew is homotopic to, let's say, this curve, because it can be continuously deformed into it, right? So what we talk about is we look at all the curves possible and we take equivalence classes based on the homotopy of these curves. So what we do is so basically since every loop can be transformed into the any other loop in on a sphere, uh, these equivalence classes is just one single, it's just one class which is a point, right? But on a torus, it is not the same. So what we say is, also note, do you know anything about groups? Uh, I will just casually mention it, not go into details. So basically, what you can do is, suppose you are given a surface. Let me draw it again. Voice lagged. Which part should I repeat? So let me repeat. So basically, yeah. So basically, suppose you are given a two manifold, and let's say you have this curve on it. You see what all curves it is, what all loops it is homotopic to. So homotopy is basically, yeah, I'm repeating. So homotopy is basically continuous deformations. So yeah, group was defined in yesterday's lecture. Cool. So I will go on. So basically, on a sphere, since every curve can be continuously deformed into any other curve, these so all the equivalence classes based on homotopy, that is, so basically any curve is homotopic to any other curve on a sphere, right? This is clear. On a sphere, any curve is homotopic to any other curve, a loop essentially. Can you reply yes or no? Yeah. But on a torus, it is not the same thing, right? So what we do is, now I will give a natural way of yeah, closed curves, loops. I will refer closed curves as loops. Also, it needs to be simple. Not so simple curves are basically which does not intersect itself. For example, this infinity sign is not a simple curve. It is closed but not simple. So I want to talk about loop simple closed curves, right? So what basically we do is, I will give you a natural way of multiplying these curves. So for example, you have, yeah. So I will show you here. Suppose you have this. Let me change the color first. Yeah. So suppose you have on a. How do we formally define closed curves? Yeah, I will move on to that topic after this history thing of topology. I will mention it. Yeah. So suppose you have this curve and you have this curve. I should draw it with different colors, I guess, right? You have I'm drawing here. So you have this one curve and you have this one curve, right? So a natural way of multiplying it is basically, what you do is disconnect it from the common point, and you can see what I did there. So I basically removed, so I remove this part and join one end with one end and the other end with other end. So it basically becomes one loop. Is it clear what we did here? Yeah. So basically we multiplied these loops into one. So naturally this gives us a group structure on the equivalence classes of the groups, right? So let me clear my screen. Yeah. So you can see a very concrete example with good drawing, not like mine, here. So this is called concatenation. So you take a loop A. Suppose your loop A goes around horizontally, and your loop becomes like this vertically. So a natural way of multiplying them is basically disconnect them from the common point and join the other ends. Join a pair of ends of each curve. So this is your loop AB, right? So this naturally gives us equivalence classes of loops under continuous deformations. So this is called a fundamental group of the surface. No, this is not related to anything to Mobius strip. This is just giving a rigorous group structure to these equivalence classes. This is not related to Mobius strips or anything. So yeah, so ultimately it will be shown that uh, using these you can prove that when you disconnect a Mobius strip from the middle, you will again get one surface instead of two different surfaces. What if there are multiple intersection points? You talk only about two curves, and if there are multiple intersections, you can again take continuous deformation and remove that other point of intersection. Get it? We are allowed continuous deformations. Yeah. So basically, you get a group structure which is called the fundamental group of the surface. So what it does is it records information about the basic shape or holes of a topological space. So Poincare answered that question in no by saying that there exist two three-dimensional surf manifolds that have same Betti numbers but different fundamental groups. He showed it. We can't show it right now. A three-dimensional manifold is what looks like our current space locally looks like a 3D space, but actually can be curved, right? So he showed that there exist two three-dimensional manifolds that have same Betti numbers but different fundamental groups. So we talk about yeah. He also gave a very important conjecture called Poincaré's conjecture. So Poincaré's conjecture is basically every simply connected means the fundamental group is trivial. Trivial means every loop can be transformed into a single point. For example, on a sphere, every loop you take, it can be contracted to one single point. So its fundamental group is trivial. So every simply connected and closed. Closed means no boundary, right? You don't have any boundary on the space. So every simply connected and closed three manifold is homeomorphic to the three sphere. This was essentially your Poincaré's conjecture, which was proved by Grigory Perelman in 2002. So this question turned out to be very difficult, and so you see, so this conjecture was proposed in 1904, and Perelman proved it in 2002. He made use of a concept called Ricci flow. We don't need to talk about this, but just so you know, he also proved William Thurston's geometrization conjecture, which is a very general statement, and Poincaré's conjecture is a very specific case on it, right? So, is the Poincaré conjecture clear? As in, what does it state? Three sphere is two or three. Three sphere is three dimensional. Three. The normal sphere we see right now is two dimensional, and so three sphere exists in 4D, right? Clear? So, is the statement of Poincaré's conjecture clear to everyone? If not, just ping on the chat. Yeah, yeah, I'll explain one more. So basically, what you do is you understand what a fundamental group is. Did you understand what a fundamental group is? Yeah. So you take these fundamental. So you say if the fundamental group is trivial, that is, if every loop can be contracted to a single point, and in the so basically, if many people have problem in understanding three manifold, so three manifold is basically a space which locally looks like your 3D space R3 locally looks like R3, but it can be curved. It can be, for example, let's say you have. Uh, let's start by taking an analogous situation of a 2D. So a two manifold, as I said, which locally looks like a plane. So you take a torus, you take any point on it, and it will locally look like a plane on a local scale. But if you say globally, it can be curved, the whole surface. Similarly, with a three manifold, it will locally look like R3. That is, you are standing in that space. For example, like we are sitting right now in this atmosphere. So it will locally look like our normal space, but globally it can be curved. It can be, it can have very different variations. You understand now what a three manifold is? Uh, just say yes or no on the chat. Okay, so I'll repeat once more. So yeah, so what you do is, yeah, it is clear. Okay, cool. So you take a three manifold and you say if the fundamental group is trivial, that is, you if you take any loop on it, it can be contracted to a single point, or and it has no boundary. If the three manifold has no boundary, for example, if you take a disk, it has boundary, right? The circle is its boundary. But if you take a sphere, sphere has no boundary, a torus has no boundary, right? That's for two manifolds. Now for, if there exists a three manifold which is simply connected and it is closed, that is, it has no boundary, then it is homeomorphic. Homeomorphic means continuously deformable to a three sphere. So it is essentially like a counterpart of, analogous to a sphere in 2D, a sphere in 3D to a sphere in 4D. A three sphere means, like for example, the normal sphere you see is a two-dimensional thing. So a counterpart of it is three-dimensional sphere, right? Cool. Is it clear? Yeah, it is intuitive, but it is very hard to prove. We will see another instance of a theorem that is very intuitive but very hard to prove. So now we move on. So now we talk about models conjectures. No, models conjectures are very, very, very important, a stepping stone on in this field of algebraic topology. So what you did, so what you do was, let's talk about first. Let me annotate. Yeah. So suppose you're given a circle. Yeah, sure. Okay. Uh, I'll move on now. Take a screenshot if you want and see it later. Right. Yeah. So what you do is basically you take, suppose you have an equation, let's say x square plus y square, a square plus b square equal to c square, the Pythagorean triplets. Now you bring c square to the denominator. So what you get is a by c whole square plus b by c whole square equal to 1. Right? So you want to look at rational solutions of x square plus y square equal to 1. Right? So the first thing that comes into mind after saying x square plus y square equal to 1 is a circle to me. So let's consider a circle. Apparently, my circle is a little tilted, but no problem. So a circle is tilted. That's weird. Yeah. So we take the point minus 0 comma 1, right? So what we do is we take a line. We take any line. Let's say this passing through minus 0 comma 1. Now we observe. Suppose you are given a point on the circle, which is, let's say, which has both coordinates rationals. So q comma q1 comma q2, both are rationals. So when, so if you join, let's say you join this now to minus 0 comma 1, you will get a rational slope. That is clear. You can, by the definition of slope, that slope will be rational if both coordinates are rational, right? Is it clear? Yeah. So given a Pythagorean, let's say a rational solution to x square plus y square equal to 1, you get a rational slope on this line, right? So the amazing thing is, what is what was not expected but is true, like you can show algebraically, if the slope is rational, then you always get a Pythagorean triplet, a Pythagorean solution to, let's say, x square plus y square equal to 1, a rational solution to. So this motivated us to consider a shape, the related geometry of the surface, the related topology of the surface, uh, to a number theory solution. You see how we related geometry to to number theory, right? To x square plus y square equal to 1, right? So whenever if you have to map all the Pythagorean solutions to x square plus y square equal to 1, the rational solutions, you just take all the lines which have rational slopes, and the corresponding points are the Pythagorean triplets, right? Is this clear? Yeah. By the way, if any part is unclear, you can just unmute yourself and speak. Okay. So yeah. So now suppose, now what we do is we take a equation like x to the power n plus y to the power n equal to 1, in the hope of analyzing x square x to the power a to the power n plus b to the power n equal to c to the power n, which will be known as Fermat's equations to you, right? So we take this equation for example, right? Now instead of looking at real solutions of it, we look at its complex solutions. So now if you see at complex solutions, you will naturally get a surface, right? Now the most amazing thing is you can relate the number of rational solutions to to x to the power n plus y to the power n equal to 1 to the shape of the surface you get. So the most amazing thing is, if you get a surface which has number of holes which has genus greater than equal to 2, then there will be only finite number of rational solutions. Like this is very amazing to me. Like this blew my mind. How can this be possible? So let's move on. So rigorously, formally, let C be a non-singular algebraic curve of genus G over Q. So essentially, we are just looking at the complex solution and observing the surface we get. Then the set of, suppose G equal to 0, then you can either get no points or infinitely many. And you handle C as a conic section. Suppose you get, so basically let me show one thing. So suppose you have this, suppose you get this. So any usual closed loop has genus 1. Wait a second. Let me complete this and I will. Now suppose this is a surface you get. Uh, so suppose this is a surface you get. This is a surface obtained by considering the complex solution of x to the power n plus y to the power n equal to 1. Some n, let's say. Now the real solution sits only on a loop on this whole surface, right? For example, we consider the circle and we looked at the real solutions to x square plus y square equal to 1, and all the rational solutions sit only on these points on the circle. Similarly, in this surface, the real solutions only sit on a loop on the surface, and the rational solutions sit somewhere in the points of these loops of this loop, right? So my theorem is, if the genus of the surface is greater than equal to 2, then there will be only a finite number of rational solutions, right? So a simple application of so this was proved by faulting. I don't remember the year as such, but this was the conjecture was given by Model and proved by faulting. So basically, a very simple application to this is uh, to the weak form of Fermat's last theorem. Now, for any fixed n greater than equal to n greater than 4, the curve of the surface you receive by plugging complex solution to x to the power n plus y to the power n equal to 1 has genus greater than 1. Genus greater than 1, that is greater than equal to 2. So you will only have finite number of finitely many integer solutions to a to the power n plus b to the power n equal to c to the power n to n is greater than 4, right? Isn't this amazing? Like, is this clear? Like, what does the conjecture say at least? And then this application. Yeah. So basically, let's say, yeah. So x to the power n plus y to the power n equal to c to the let's say you have this x to the power n. This is mainly dependent. This is mainly based on the fact that complex number has two coordinates to represent it. So, for example, if you look at the real solutions, which has only one coordinate to represent it, you will get a loop, right, in 2D sphere. So, but complex numbers have two coordinates to represent them. So you will get, let's say, you will get a surface. You understand why? Is this? This should be intuitively clear. I can't explain mathematically right now. Why is it unintuitive? Which part is unintuitive? That you get a surface. Uh, can you type in the chat which part is unintuitive? Or just unmute yourself and speak up. Uh, am I audible to everyone? I can't see any response. I mean the no rational. Yeah. Oh, so this is a theorem, right? I can't prove it right now. It takes 200 pages of hard mathematics if you get the reference. Yeah. So the theorem is if you get a surface which has genus greater than equal to 2, then you get finitely many rational solutions. I did not say no rational solution. I said finitely many rational solutions if the genus is greater than equal to 2. This is not intuitive. Yeah, this is not intuitive. This is a theorem which is based, like, which is a very remarkable feat in topology, in algebraic topology, right? This is in no way intuitive to me, at least. This is just to convey to you all that how topology can, the connection of topology to other fields, for example, number theory. This surface would be 4D, right? No. Well, if you see, yeah, you will have to represent that surface in 4D. Yes. But the surface itself would be, yeah. So for example, you can get something like, if you consider other Diophantine equations, you can get, so let's say, from these you can get double torus, triple torus. But from other solutions, you can get, suppose, Klein bottle. You can get various number of surface, which surface is 2D. Yeah, exactly. Surface is 2D, but you might need 4D to represent it. Like, for example, if you get Klein model for some surface, for some equation, then you'll need 4D. Uh, it can be 3D. Basically, 4D can represent it all. Yeah. So I'll move on. Clear my- Now, we move. So we are done with the history and connections to other subjects of to topology. Now we will talk essentially about simple closed curves. Now we move back to surfaces. We will discuss about surfaces now. How are we getting a surfaces in this just a curve? No, if you map real solution. So suppose now a very let's say, suppose you have a suppose you see real solutions to the equation, then you get a curve. For example, you see x square plus 5 square equal to 1, and you want to observe the real solutions of it, then you get a circle, then you get a curve. But if you're considering complex solutions which has two coordinates to represent, which needs two coordinates to represent it, you need a 2D surface, right? Is this statement? Yeah, cool. So now we move back to surfaces, and we talk about simple closed curves first. So a simple closed curve is basically a continuous image of circle that does not intersect itself. Simple means simple means that the curve does not intersect itself. Closed means the curve has no ends. So you can see here a circle is, so let's say a circle. This is a simple closed curve. This is not. This is closed but not simple, right? uh, this is simple but not closed, right? So simple closed curve can be, have you seen Coach snowflake? It's a fractal. Have you seen it? Let me show it. Let me show it. So I do I have it here? Doesn't look like it. I don't have it in the slide. So basically, yeah, here it is. Can you see the figure here? It's a Coach snowflake. It's a fractal, right? So this is also a simple closed curve. It does not intersect itself and it is closed, right? So your simple closed curve can even be a fractal. It can even be smooth. It can be nowhere differentiable, right? So let's move on. So Jordan curve theorem is a very fundamental theorem in topology. So the Jordan curve theorem is deceptively simple and very intuitively clear, right? But it's not mathematically obvious. So the Jordan curve theorem states that any continuous simple closed curve in the plane separates the plane into two disjoint regions, the inside and the outside. For example, in a circle, you have the inside, which is the bounded component, and outside, which is the unbounded component, right? So the theorem must be intuitively clear to everyone. Yes. The main problem why I'm saying it is not mathematically obvious is, when you say a thing is mathematically obvious, you mean you can easily give a proof of it, right? That's what mathematically obvious means to me, right? So the problem in proving this theorem is essentially that your curve can even be a fractal, right? So analyzing that curve can be very difficult. But suppose your curve is smooth, or your curve is piecewise smooth, then proving the theorem is not very hard, which we will do in the assignment. We will prove Jordan curve theorem for piecewise smooth curves. It will be a walkthrough type assignment, and you can check it out after the class. So next class is tomorrow, right? So we will discuss about the assignment in our question answer session. So do it in that question answer session. So yeah, so the main problem in proving Jordan curve theorem is that how varied the surfaces can be. It can be even a fractal, it can be nowhere differentiable, right? So the first correct proof of Jordan curve theorem was given in 1905 by Oswald Veblen, if I'm pronouncing it right. Yeah, so however, his proof left open the question if the inside and outside of the curve you took is homeomorphic to a disk. Like for example, you take, suppose you take some, yeah, so you take this fractal, right? You consider the inside of the surface, is it homeomorphic to a disk? Again, intuition says yes, right? And outside is the unbounded component. So this is known as Jordan Schoenflies theorem, and it was proved by Schoenflies in 1909, in 1906. The proof was corrected by Brouwer. So the Jordan Schoenflies theorem is, for any simple closed curve in the plane, there is a homeomorphism of the plane which takes that curve into the standard circle. That is, the interior of the curve is homeomorphic to a disk, and the unbounded component, the outside of the curve, is essentially the same as the unbounded component of a circle, right? So is the statement clear to all of you? Yes. If not, just speak up, unmuting yourself, right? Yes, clear and intuitive, but again, not mathematically obvious, right? So let's now, can we generalize this to higher dimensions? That is a very natural question. No, the thing is, the Jordan curve theorem generalizes very nicely to higher dimensions. That is, if suppose you have a n minus one dimensional sphere, or n minus one dimensional space, that is simple, that does not intersect itself and has no ends. That is now the that space is n minus one dimensional space is sitting inside the n dimensional Euclidean space. Then it separates the n dimensional space into two regions, the inside and the outside, right? So this is correct. However, this is unintuitive to me somehow, that the Jordan Schoenflies theorem does not generalize to higher dimensions. In three-dimensional case, a counterexample was found in 1924 by J.W. Alexander. It's called Alexander's horn sphere. So essentially, suppose you take a loop. Which part to repeat? The Jordan curve theorem. Uh, can you mention which part to repeat? Jordan curve theorem. Okay. So Jordan curve theorem is basically, you know what a simple closed curve is, right? You understand what a simple closed curve is? Can you type yes? Yeah. So suppose you have a simple closed curve. Let's say you have this simple closed curve, right? This is a simple closed curve. Suppose you have this curve. Now the Jordan curve theorem says that this, what you do is basically take the whole plane and remove this loop, right? Remove the image of this loop. What you get is two connected components, right? That's exactly what Jordan curve theorem says. It says that you get two connected components on considering the loop, one is inside the loop and one is outside the loop. This is Jordan curve theorem. While it is intuitively obvious, but it is difficult to prove because your curve can be fractal, and so many kind of curves are possible. Is it clear now what Jordan curve theorem is? Yeah. Now, yeah. So in this, suppose you take this. Yeah, I'm returning to Alexander's Horn sphere. Can a simple closed curve be infinite? We normally, yeah, it can be, right. In length, for example, the fractal we considered, its length is infinite. Area cannot be taken infinite because we have to contain it in a region, right? If the area is infinite, then you can't possibly take, like, you can consider it even like it will be still be correct, but normally what the convention is to take it such that area is finite, length need not be finite. For example, in that fractal's length is infinite, right? So yeah, can you show the fractal one? Yeah, sure. This is a fractal. So what you do is basically you take this snowflake. You can read about fractals online, and you will know that their lengths are the perimeter of the fractal is infinite. Now I'm moving back to the next slides. Yeah. So this is the Alexander's Horn sphere, which is a counterexample to Jordan Schoenflies curve theorem in higher dimensions. So suppose you take this curve. So suppose you take this curve. This cannot be taken out of this surface without passing it through the surface. So which is a so essentially the inside of it is not a disk, right? Suppose inside is the disk, like, you get what I'm saying, right? Jordan's conflies is not true for higher dimensions. You you separate the space using the surface into two parts, the interior and exterior, but you don't have that the inside is will be a sphere and outside will be the essentially homeomorphic to the unbounded component of the sphere. So I'll move to the next slide. Yeah, so what is a surface? So surface is basically a two-dimensional manifold. A two-dimensional manifold, I hope, is clear now what it intuitively means. So a space that looks like a plane in the neighborhood of any point, which is locally it looks like a plane, but globally it can be curved. It can have various type of. Can you repeat the separation theorem? Yeah. So separation theorem is basically generalizing the Jordan curve theorem into higher dimensions. Suppose you have a n minus one dimensional sphere, n minus one dimensional simple closed surface kind of in n dimensional space, then it will separate the n dimensional space into two parts, the interior and the exterior. It is just a generalization of Jordan curve theorem to higher dimensions, right? So yeah, so what is the surface? As I told you, a surface is a two-dimensional manifold. So what it topologically means is we say that the local topology of a surface is that of a plane, right? So we will use rubber sheet to represent these surfaces. A rubber sheet has no thickness and can be shrunk and stretched at will. And under some conditions, you can cut the surface, but you will have to glue it back in the same orientation. So, for example, let's say I have I take this kind of surface and I cut it along this and I give it a orientation, right? Let's talk about triangle. Suppose I have this triangle, I cut it along this with this orientation. So now I have this and I have this with these two orientations. Now what I will do is basically I can continuously deform this surface into this, but the orientation will still remain there. This, and suppose I remove like this, and I will have to glue them back in the same orientation, right? So is it clear that what you can do upon cutting? You have to you have to stick to a same orientation, right? So This is a rubber sheet, so these all restrictions we give to these kind of sheets. It can be shrunk and stretched to will. It has no thickness. It has no thickness because suppose you consider the thickness, that will add another dimension to it. So it will essentially be a 3D object, three-dimensional manifold instead of a two-dimensional manifold, right? So it has no thickness. So now we talk about different families of surfaces. These are in no way exclusive. I'm just talking about criteria which you can use to describe a surface. So a planar surface is one which can be fit into a plane. Non-planar, again, which cannot be fit into a plane. Now we will give examples of both of these surfaces. Closed surfaces which have no boundary, and surfaces with boundary, for example, a disk. A closed surface, for example, like a torus, and surface with boundary, for example, a disk. Orientable and non-orientable, we will discuss it later on. So first of all comes planar and non-planar surfaces. So planar surfaces are essentially the surfaces which will fit into the plane. Uh, by the way, if you need break anytime, just let me know. Time is 12:13. It looks like I have 45 minutes left. So I think I should continue right now. If anyone wants a break, just let me know. Is it okay if I just continue without giving the break? Yeah. Is everyone okay, right? So I'll continue. Yeah, cool. So suppose you have this surface. Now what you could do is basically, for some examples include, you see why these surfaces, uh, like this shirt, is planar in fact. It is represented in 3D, but if you continuously deform it, it is what, like for example, you take this pant, this shorts first. So it is essentially this surface, and the inside is filled all. Inside is filled. So this pant, this shorts is essentially this surface which can be fit into a plane, right? You understand why this shirt or these surfaces are planar, right? Does everyone understand? Yeah, sure. Essentially, just press it against the bottom, right? Can you show the multi-armed student? Yeah, we can show. It is essentially this hole. Take a big circle and remove holes from it. Let me show why. So essentially, what you do is take a disc, right? Why do we say that a disc is same as this surface? A mug without handle. A disc is same as mug without handle. Basically, take the mug without handle and just compress it. T-shirt has three holes, right? Yes, T-shirt has three holes. This surface I drew was that of the shorts, which has two. No, it has three holes. That one hole is not essentially a hole if you see, right? Like I'm showing you, right? This disc you say, this has zero holes, right? But if you just bring the surfaces up the plane, then you get this mug. This mug does not have a hole. Yeah, that one hole becomes a boundary essentially. Yes. So right, now you all understand why these all are planar surfaces. Yes. I'll continue. So, however, most surfaces do not fit in a plane. So, for example, this. If you see this surface, can you see how this is different from a, let's say, how it is different from this? Why can't this be embedded on a plane? Can you see this? You'll need at least three dimension, like you'll need at least 3D to show the surface, not to represent it, but to show the surface, right? This surface cannot be planar. Can everyone see that? Yeah, cool. So I'll move on. So this does not fit into a plane, right? Now, next family of surfaces we talked about is orientable and non-orientable. I'll not discuss the closed versus the surfaces with boundary. It is just what the name says. The former has no boundary, the latter has boundaries, right? So let's move on to orientable and non-orientable surfaces. A orientable surface is the one in which you can give up every point on the surface a consistent choice. Is torus and non? Yeah, a torus is a non-planar surface. It cannot be embedded on a plane, right? So a surface is orientable if you have a consistent choice of normal vectors at every point. This is, however, not possible if you see that if you say every surface has a consistent choice of normal vector, which is false, because suppose you take a Mobius strip. If you constructed the Mobius strip, as I said, uh, take any point and start tracing it, you'll get essentially one side, right? So you can't possibly give a consistent choice of surface normal vector at every point. You understand why you can't give a consistent choice of normal vector? I'll give other equivalent definitions of orientable and non-orientable, through which it will be very clear why Mobius strip is non-orientable. So let's look at those definitions first. So as a consequence, you can define a clockwise orientation consistently by right-hand rule. Because if you can give a consistent choice of normal vector, then by right-hand rule you have a clockwise orientation, right? Another equivalent definition is that there exists no continuous path on which we can move, and it on returning to that starting point, it looks like the object looks like its mirror image. So let's first understand what this says. Now, can you see? So what we do is I take this unit square and I give it this orientation. The same, this b maps to each other, and you have to fold it in a way that the orientation is satisfied. The arrows are mapped to each other. Similarly for the ace. Can you see why? Can you see visually why this gives us a torus? Just write yes or no on the chat. You have to fold this unit square till the b's and the a's coincide in the orientation of the arrows, right? So this gives us a torus. Now essentially wherever you move, suppose I move here, let's say to the right, I will return from this side. I'll return from here, but my orientation will always be the same. But this is false for Mobius strip. A Mobius strip is essentially this surface. You So basically these two pair of opposite sides are mapped to each other with this orientation. So you have to twist it a little bit with before pasting. So this gives us a Mobius strip. Can you see why? Uh, just say yes or no. Here you have to paste only one pair of opposite sides, not the other. Just pasting one pair of opposite sides in opposite orientation. Basically, you're giving it a half twist, just as you do by pasting opposite sides of a strip of paper by giving it a half twist. This is essentially the same. Everyone understands, right? Just say yes or no on the chat. Am I audible? Voice is lagging. Is voice lagging for everyone? Hello? Hello? Am I audible? Just say yes or no. Is it clear now? Yeah. So is it not lagging, right? It is not lagging right now. Yeah. So what I was saying is, you consider this surface, you glue this unit square, and you glue these opposite pair of sides to each other with this orientation, with the opposite orientation. Can you observe that this gives us the Mobius strip? Yes. Yeah. So now when you move on this surface instead, suppose I move to the right side and I come out of the opposite side. So suppose I was like this here and I was going to the left, I will come out like this. So I will be I will return as a mirror image of my own, right? This is clear. So essentially, this is a non-orientable surface. So there exists a path in a non-orientable surface upon which if you move, then when you return, you look like your own mirror image. This is an equivalent definition of Mobius strip of a non-orientable surface. So orientable surface is one in which there exists no such path. So other examples include disk, sphere, double torus, torus. Next, a surface is called non-orientable. Again, two equivalent definition. If there is no consistent choice of normal vector at every point. So a very peculiar property of non-orientable surfaces is that the left right notion does not make sense globally. If you observed in Mobius strip, you can't possibly give a proper left right notation to it globally, right? Have you seen it? Like, can you see it? That left right does not make sense in a Mobius strip. If you are on the left side, you'll return on the right side later. So essentially, there is no left right sense in a Mobius strip. So a very interesting property of non-orientable surface is that it has a Mobius band as a surface. Every non-orientable surface has a Mobius band as a surface. For if you can find a loop in the surface upon which left and right does not make sense, then the neighborhood of this loop is the surface of the surface is a Mobius band. So essentially, Mobius band is a very basic object of non-orientability. So again, the equivalent definition is there exists a continuous path on which one can move and look like its own mirror image on returning to the starting point, right? So as I showed earlier, using a Mobius strip, so we conclude Mobius strip is non-orientable. Other examples include projective plane. So let me talk about it. So let's talk about surface you can get by pasting opposite sides of a unit square. So we saw a torus. Suppose we do this. Can you see this gives us a Klein bottle? Can everyone see this gives us a Klein bottle? Yeah. Now another, what is a Klein bottle? So we will talk about it later. If you don't know, just ignore it for now. So suppose you have this. You paste both sides in opposite orientation. Fun fact: this is projective plane. If you can do this, if you paste this, you need more than 3 dimensions to represent it. But if you can do this, then this is a projective plane. We can prove it later on, but not now. And just to show you what you can get by pasting opposite sides using. So basically, is this clear? Is it Klein model? So I hope Klein model is clear to everyone. So let's move on. So some terminology. A arc is basically a simple continuous image of a line segment. Simple again means no self intersections. A cut line will mean an arc in the surface connecting two boundary points. Right? For example, you have this, and let me take a different color. This is a cut line, an arc in the surface connecting two boundary points. A substantial arc is basically a cut line that does not separate a surface. For example, let me take this surface. This is called annulus, the one I'm drawing right now. Basically, the basically inside there is a hole, and basically you remove a disc uh, from the disc, right? So this is called an annulus. And suppose I take this cut line. This does not disconnect the surface. This does not separate the surface, right? You still get this surface, which is connected. So this will be called as a substantial arc. And the rank of the surface with boundary will be the maximum number of non-intersecting substantial arcs which you can remove before connecting the surface, disconnecting the surface. So, for example, in this annulus, there will be one, the rank will be one. Isn't rank equal to genus? No, we are talking about we are not we are talking about surfaces with boundary. We are not talking about closed surfaces. Genus is defined for closed surfaces. You can define for surfaces with boundary also. Yeah. So now what I will do is basically draw another surface, and you everyone just tell its rank. I draw this surface. I'm drawing two surfaces. Just write on the chat the rank of these two surfaces. And another one. Or just one, or just this one. What is the rank of this surface? Two. Yes. Yeah. Is everyone clear with it? You take two arcs, two substantial arcs. You disconnect them. After that, you can't disconnect anymore, right? Yeah. One more. Let me show one more. What is the rank of this surface? Yes. Yes. So suppose I connect this, then I have to connect this. This will be two. Yeah. So I suppose I hope rank the concept of rank is clear to everyone. Where was I? Yeah, sometime. A homeomorphism, as I defined, is a continuous deformation which has a continuous inverse, right? So now what we will do is characterize a disk. So let's first see what we can do with a disk. So suppose I have this filled circle, which is a disk. So we see there is no substantial arc on this surface, right? And whenever we disconnect the surface using a cut line, we will get two disks again. Is this clear to everyone? Whenever we disconnect a yeah. So essentially, this fact alone can help us characterize the disk. Characterization of disk is basically any arc between boundary points separates the disk into two pieces, each of which is a disk. That is, there are no substantial arcs in the disk, and the disk is the only surface with this property. We will prove this. So first, we will prove that this property characterizes the disk. So let me show. What we do is basically suppose. So first, let's start by you have suppose two triangles, and if you glue them along this line, this and this, then you can again get a triangle. You see that? You can continue, you get a quadrilateral, and then you can continuously deform it into a triangle, right? And note this triangle is essentially a disk. So every disk can be triangulated, right? So what we do is basically, so we're basically proving that there is only one surface of rank 0. Yes, that's what we are doing. One more, only not only rank 0, there is one extra condition that rank 0, and if you cut the surface along any cut line, then the two parts you get are disk individually. There may be some pathological example of another rank 0 surface. But essentially, the main surface we look at when we consider rank 0 is a disk. So yeah, so the proof goes by, first we will show that this property characterizes the disk. As I showed, so you have two triangles which if we glue them, then you get the same topology as either of the original triangles, right? So if suppose any space is made from gluing two disks together along the boundary, and it is still a disk, right? Then it has to, suppose you take two disks and you glue them along any point, along any segment of the boundary, right? You can rewrite the gluing process in terms of triangles. You can take the disk, triangulate it, and then rewrite all the process using triangles. And then using our initial observation, we see you again get a triangle, right? So that triangle is again a disk. So we have shown that any space with the separation property such that if you take, as stated above, is a disk. Now let's prove that disk has this property, right? So what we want to prove is that if we take a cut line and divide disk along that cut line, you get a disk. You get two another disks. So suppose I have this, I take this cut line, I get two disks. I have to prove this. Now what we do is start at one end of the cut line, move along the cut line, and start either left or right. Suppose I go left and trace the boundary of the disk. So note we get a simple closed curve. By Jordan curve theorem, by Jordan-Schonflies theorem, the simple closed curve encloses a disk. So we prove that this part is a disk. Similarly, following the same logic on the other side, we get the other part is also a disk, right? So we use Jordan curve theorem, Jordan-Schonflies theorem to prove that whenever you have a disk and you divide using a cut line, you get two another disks. And we also prove that any surface with this property has to be a disk using the previous slide, right? So is it clear to everyone? Yes, cool. So so we see that looking at the separation properties of a surface can tell us a lot about it. You can see, consider lower dimensional analog to see why a line and a circle is different. Can you see why a line and a circle is different? For this, if some just unmute and speak. Just if someone sees why a line and a circle are different, just speak up. You just unmute yourself and speak.
For a line, if we consider any two points and there is only one path between them, but for a circle there are two paths.
Yeah, that's a possible explanation. Another explanation is, as I suggested, using separation properties. Take a point out of the line, it will disconnect it. Take a point out of the circle, it will not disconnect it. So essentially, these two surfaces are different. Clear to everyone? Yes. Yeah, cool. Now let's move on. Yeah. So now we will try to correct. This is the last section of today's talk. We will continue after this. We will continue tomorrow after doing this topic, characterizing other planar surfaces. Now what we want to do is characterize other, this is a particular example of a planar surface. Now what we want to do is characterize other planar surfaces. So let's look at these planar surfaces, and I already drew the substantial arcs on them. So can you observe the number of boundary circles and the relation of it with the rank of the surface? Can you write it on the chat if you observe, uh, or just unmute and speak? Difference of 1. Yes. And which is the greater one? The number of boundary circles. So we observe that through these examples that the rank of the surface of a planar surface is always one less than the number of boundary circles. Well, we can prove it, right? We will prove it right now. And we will also prove the fact that this characterizes all planar surfaces, right? So let's try to prove it. But before, so this is our main theorem we want to prove for today. In planar surfaces, the number of the rank is one less than the number of circles on the boundary. Either the number of boundary circles or the number of substantial arcs then henceforth can be used to distinguish the planar surface. So let's prove it. But before proving this important theorem, we need to prove a more fundamental question. That is whether substantial arcs are topological invariants. That is, suppose you take a surface with any number of holes and you disconnect different substantial arcs from them, and suppose we have a I continuously deform this into another surface. For this, let's take the pair of mats. Then are the substantial arcs from the first surface continuously deformed into the another one? So we will prove that if we prove this, that substantial arcs are topological invariants, substantial arcs are mapped to substantial arcs when we continuously deform it, we will prove that if one surface is homomorphic to another, then the number of substantial arcs on both of them has to be same. That is, the rank of both the surfaces has to be same, right? This is clear. Uh, what we want to prove right now, first, right? Yeah. So we want to prove that substantial arcs are topological invariants. So for this we will use two theorems. First is continuous image of connected sets is connected, right? I will prove it right now. I hope you have done open sets. Have you done open sets? Right, right. Someone told me that you have already done open sets, so I can use them. If not, I will have to skip this proof, or just I will mention the proof, and you can revisit it later when you know about open sets. So I'll mention the proof. So suppose you have, this is a topological space T1, and you have a function f, a continuous function f to T2. I have to prove that if we have some, let's say I have this space S1, and we look at f of S1, I have to prove f of S1 is also connected if S1 was connected. So I assume S1 is connected, and now I have to prove f of S1 is also connected. Now suppose not. So so you can see uh, a very intuitive and a good definition of connectedness. Suppose we say two a set is disconnected, then you can see that you can contain them then that you can contain that set within two open sets. Suppose you have S1. So I suppose f of S1 is not connected, that is, it is disconnected. Then I can find two open sets uh, such that union of both contain S1, but intersection of, let's say I call this U1, this first open set, and I call this U2, and I call this V2, the second open set. Then U2 and V2 is intersection are is phi, is empty, but U2 and V2 does contain f of S1. You see why this would mean that f of S1 is disconnected? Just say yes or no. Yes, right? Okay. So now what we do is take their pre-image. We take f inverse. Note, continuous image maps open surfaces to open surfaces and close to close. So when we take if we take the inverse image of u2 and v2, suppose we get u1 and this is v1, right? We get u1 and v1. Now, note, suppose you have a point in here. suppose you have a point in u2 intersection f of s1, then you will get a point in here. So any point suppose you take, it has to be, it has in f of s1, it has to be sitting in one of u2 or v2. Then it will be mapped inversely to u1 and v1, inside u1 and v1, right? And now suppose they have, suppose let's say this green part, that is the inverse image, u1 and v1 has some point in common. Suppose let's say x belongs to u1 intersection v1 intersection f inverse of this f of s1. Then f of x would be contained in u1 u2 intersection v2 intersection f of s1, which is trivial, which is empty, I mean, right? uh, can you hear now? Yeah. So what I did was, so I had, this is my u1. I took inverse images of v1, u2 and v2, right? So I proved then that the inverse image will force, if you take inverse image of the open sets, it has to be, yeah, I'm repeating right now. So suppose you have, this is your u2, suppose u2 and v2 is clear, right? What is u2 and v2? Two open sets which has empty intersection, but their union contains f of s1. I'll call f of s1 to be s2, right? So suppose now I take inverse image of u2 and v2. This is u1 and this is v1. These are the inverse images of u2 and v2. Now u2 intersection s2 will be mapped to somewhere here, u1 intersection f inverse s2, and v2 intersection s2 will be mapped inversely to somewhere between v1 intersection f inverse s2. Now I will prove that they all three don't have any common point. Now suppose they have a common point. Suppose you have x, let me choose another color. Suppose you have x in u1 v1 and f inverse, that is slash cap, which is the intersection part, which is the intersection in LaTeX. So is equal to f of f inverse s2. Then apply f to both sides. Then you will get f of x is in f of u1 intersection f of v1 intersection f of f inverse s2, which is u2 intersection v2 intersection s2, which is actually empty. u2 intersection v2 intersection s2 we prove to be empty. So there cannot be such an x possible. So we prove that there is no x possible such that it lies in the intersection of these three, u1 v1 and f inverse s2. That would force our s1 to be disconnected, which will be a contradiction to the fact that s1 was connected. uh, if this proof is not clear uh, because of the notation parts, you can again revisit it after being comfortable with open sets, mappings, connected the notion of connectedness. If this proof is not clear, I will remove it from now, and if you have proved, if you understand the proof, good. If not, this is a very intuitive property that continuous image of connected sets is connected, right? So I'll move on. Now, furthermore, it can be proved from the first point that if a set X maps surjectively to space Y, so suppose you have X, you map it to space Y, and suppose there exists a subset which separates this Y, right? Suppose there exists a subset B which separates this Y. Then upon taking the pre-image of B, when you consider the pre-image of B, then that would have to separate X. This follows from the first one, the first point. Is this clear to everyone that why would that the pre-image of B would have to separate X? Yes, cool. So yeah, so what we proved was that so essentially we proved that the arcs are connected. Since the arcs are connected, so their continuous images are also connected. Now, if the continuous image is also substantial, that it also separates, then the pre-image also has to separate. And since we have homeomorphisms which are both side continuous, hence we prove that if you have a substantial arc in one and you take a continuous deformation, you will get a substantial arc in another one in the continuously deformed surface. This is clear? Yes, cool. So we proved that so whenever you take a substantial arc and map continuously deform it, then you also get a substantial arc. So for example, now the annulus, which has a disc removed from a disc, has a substantial arc, and since disc has none, so these both are different because if you take any continuous deformation of an annulus, every the substantial arc in it has to map to another substantial arc. But since disc has none, these two surfaces cannot be the same, right? Is this clear? I'll uh, I'll now move to proving the main. And yeah, so first we will prove this. First we will discuss about this. The rank of a surface with boundary is an invariant of the surface. We just proved it that the substantial arcs are mapped to a topological invariant. So the number of substantial arcs, that is the rank of the surface, is invariant of the surface up to continuous deformations, but it is not complete. Complete means if you have two surfaces of the same rank, if it was complete, then the surfaces would have to be the same. An example of this uncompletedness is this. Consider these two surfaces. Now both have rank 2. We just proved it earlier, right? But these two surfaces are not same because one is planar, another is non-planar. Yes. So this distinguish of if we distinguish on base of rank, then the invariant is not complete. There exist surfaces of the same rank that are different. However, if we consider only planar surfaces, the rank is a complete invariant of the planar surfaces with boundary, which is a theorem we set out to prove in the last slide. We said that when we can use either the rank or the number of boundary circles to completely distinguish planar circles, planar surfaces. Now, one thing I have to show that you can use boundary circles always to differentiate between uh, planar surfaces. Suppose there is a planar surface with a number of boundary circles equal to n, right? Then there has to be an outer surface, which is a boundary circle, and by Jordan curve theorem, it encloses a disk, and the rest all n minus 1 boundary circles are contained within this disk. So essentially, all these surfaces, which is which has n boundary circles, n boundary components, is essentially a disk which from which n minus 1 disks have been removed. And since disks are homeomorphic, we can continuously deform this to each another, right? Is this clear? That we can use that number of boundary circles completely determines the planar surface. It essentially becomes a standard surface which has disks removed from a number of holes removed from a big disk. Is this clear? Just say yes or no. Uh, can if anyone is having a problem, just unmute yourself and just tell me where is the problem exactly. Or am I audible? I'm getting no response. Is the Yeah? So is it clear right now? Is it clear to everyone? Yeah. So now we proved that the number of rank in a planar surface is one less than the number of boundary circles. So what is your plan of attack? What do you think should we do to prove this fact? Just type it in the chat. What do you think we should do? What is your plan of attack on the theorem, on the problem? We will do induction to prove the fact. So yeah, induction. So we will prove by induction that the rank of a planar surface is one less than the number of boundary circles, right? So let's prove it. This is the last result of the day. So now on note, we will induct on the number of boundary components. The result holds when the number of boundary components is equal to 1, because number of boundary components is equal to 1 and it is a planar surface, that is it is a disk. Then whichever cut line you remove, it will separate the surface, so the rank is 0, right? So the rank is 1 less than the number of boundary components in the case that number of boundary components is 1. Now suppose we have a planar surface with k boundary points, with k boundary components. We want to show that the rank is k minus 1. Now the first thing to observe is that a substantial arc has to connect different boundary circles. Why is this true? Because suppose you connect the same boundary circle using a cut line, then by Jordan curve theorem you can find that, for example how we did that in the case of a disk. So we took a cut line, we traced its path, we get a simple closed path, and we get a disconnected surface, right? So is it clear to everyone why a substantial arc has to connect different boundary circles? If yes, just type yes in the chat. Yes, yes. So so we see that now suppose we connect. Now suppose I have these two holes, like these two boundary circles. Now I connect it using this, right? I take this substantial arc. Now what it will do is this will make these two boundary circles into one. Can you see why? So essentially these two boundary circles will become like this. They will be transferred into one, right? So yeah, it's clear to everyone. Just type yes. That when connected with a substantial arc, two boundary circles will become into one, right? So now what we do is we take a substantial circle, a substantial arc, and this we have a suppose we have k boundary components, and we connect disconnect and we take a substantial arc between any two boundary components. So what we get is a surface with k minus 1 boundary components, right? By induction hypothesis, the rank of that surface is k minus 2, but since we disconnected one arc in reaching that surface, our rank of the new surface is k minus 2 plus 1, which is k minus 1. Right? Hence proved that the rank is 1 less than the number of circles. Yes, cool. So next, yeah. So we proved that we get, so hence we are done. And now I have stated the same thing which I told you earlier, that if you have n boundary components, then it is essentially so you can so it is essentially a big disk with holes removed from it, and since these the holes are disks, and those are homeomorphic, you can always continuously deform it into one another. So essentially, either rank, which is number of boundary components minus one, or or the boundary components can be used to differentiate a planar surface. So this was the last theorem of the day. Why I introduced the notion of but why are number of boundary components finite? We consider them to be finite. Looks like I missed them. I missed that hypothesis. Uh, we consider them to be finite. That's a compact surface. We are characterizing all compact planar surfaces. Okay. So why I introduce the notion of rank? So something like yes, it won't work here. Uh, I don't recognize what this is. Can you just annotate it? Wait. Let me give you access to this annotation of the screen. Ashwat. You can annotate now. Uh, can you represent it on the screen? What this essentially is? I'm not aware of it.
So the CLC triangle is like this fractal. So we have a
I get it. I
triangle,
get it. I get it.
and then you remove the central triangle.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, I get it. Yeah, I
you keep
remember.
on doing that.
Yeah. So no, this is not applicable to that because we are considering only compact planar surface. This is so compact planar surfaces is the one. So you understand what I'm saying, right? It has to have finite number of holes. So why I introduced the notion of rank was that if you consider any surface, not necessarily any orientable surface, not necessarily planar, what we can have is we have two things to differentiate it, to uniquely determine it. We can use either the rank, we have to use both rank and the number of boundary circles to uniquely determine it. So a random orientable surface can be uniquely determined by given its rank or given its boundary components. We will prove this later on, like in the tomorrow, most probably. So that's it for now. See you. What's the time of the question answer sessions? I guess it's 2:30, right? Yeah, it's 2:30. So let's meet at 2:30. We will discuss. Do attend it because we will be discussing Jordan curve theorem for piecewise smooth curves. There, we will essentially prove it over 2 days. This proof is short, but since it has a assignment format, we will prove it over 2 days. So I will be discussing a lot about it in the question answer session. So see you at 2:30. Bye. By the way, if anyone has any doubts right now, just unmute yourself and speak. I'll wait for 1 or 2 minutes. If anyone has any doubts, you all can. Those who have no doubts can leave. Yeah, doubts are supposed to be discussed in Q&A session. But if you have any immediate doubts, I can just resolve them now too. So it doesn't seem anyone has any doubts. So bye everyone. I hope you enjoyed. Yeah, why isn't torus planar? Okay, so I'll let me show you. You share. Yeah. So basically, how can you like torus is when you see a torus. Wait, let me share my screen first. Share content. Yeah. So let me draw here. So this is your essentially a torus. When you see the torus is containing some volume in it. You see that the surface has some volume in it, like the inside part. It is not exactly a hole, but the inside of the torus is encompassing some volume. It possesses some volume, right? So you can't basically just compress it like that, right? You can't. That will the deformation will not be continuous if you just just press it and remove that volume. So figure has to be open. I don't understand what you mean by that. uh, can you unmute yourself and uh, we prove that it is planar, it must be. No, 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 we just We proved that if it is planar, it must be a disk, but it has no boundary. No, 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 no. If it has no, yeah, exactly. But this is a valid point that if it has no boundary, it cannot be planar. Like, how can you represent something on a plane if it does not have a boundary? Another reason for it is the one I just told, that it can encompasses some volume in it. If you compress that volume, you can't make that volume zero. uh, by the logic, if you because the deformation will be not continuous at time. So if you suppose you have a sphere, the same logic applies to it. If you compress it, you can't essentially make it into a disk, right? Because again, the deformation will not be continuous. So okay, got it. Yeah, so if anyone has any other doubts, so I guess bye for now. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Okay, bye, thank you. Where do I exit the meeting? Where do I exit the meeting?